In 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of his power. Continental Europe belonged to him. From Spain to Poland, from Italy to the German states, his armies dictated borders, governments, and laws. Kings bowed or disappeared. Republics rose and fell by his permission. No general in history had conquered faster. No empire had expanded with such precision. And yet there was one enemy he could not defeat: Britain. Its armies were smaller, its population was limited. Its territory was an island, exposed and isolated, but Britain possessed something Napoleon could not destroy with cannons or cavalry: money. British factories never stopped. British ships ruled the oceans. British banks financed wars, coalitions, and rebellions across Europe. Even when Napoleon crushed armies on land, British gold rebuilt them. Britain did not need to win battles, it only needed to survive. Napoleon understood this. He believed wars were not decided on battlefields alone but in treasuries. Britain's true strength was not its navy, it was its economy, its trade, its credit system, its ability to finance endless resistance. So Napoleon made a decision that would change everything. If Britain could not be invaded, it would be suffocated. In 1806, after defeating Prussia, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree. It was not a military order, it was an economic weapon. All ports under French control were closed to British goods. Trade with Britain was forbidden. British ships were banned. British merchants declared enemies. This became known as the Continental System. Napoleon believed it was brilliant. If Britain lost access to European markets, its factories would collapse. Unemployment would explode. The British government would be forced to negotiate. The empire would fall not by invasion but by bankruptcy. It was economic warfare on an unprecedented scale. At least on paper. Europe was not just Napoleon's empire, it was Britain's customer. British textiles clothed millions. British tools powered workshops. British colonial goods, sugar, coffee, tobacco, flowed into every European port. Merchants depended on it, governments taxed it, consumers demanded it. Cutting Britain off meant cutting Europe off from itself. At first, enforcement seemed strong. French customs officers seized goods, ports were inspected, smugglers were hunted. British products were burned publicly as symbols of defiance. Napoleon wanted the world to see that Europe would no longer feed Britain's wealth. But economics does not obey decrees. British merchants adapted instantly. They rerouted trade through neutral ships. Goods passed through Portugal, Scandinavia, and the Baltic. Smuggling networks exploded. Entire coastal regions lived off illegal British trade. Corruption followed. Officials looked away. Local economies depended on the very goods they were supposed to destroy. The blockade leaked from the beginning. And worse, it hurt France more than Britain. French industry was not ready to replace British manufacturing. Prices rose, shortages spread, ports went silent, merchants went bankrupt, tax revenue declined, consumers blamed the empire, not Britain. Napoleon responded the only way he knew how. He tightened control. More troops, more inspections, more decrees, more punishment. And with every attempt to enforce the system, resistance grew. Spain erupted into rebellion. Portugal openly defied the blockade. The Netherlands collapsed economically. Even Napoleon's allies began to cheat because survival demanded it. Britain, meanwhile, did not collapse. Its navy dominated global trade, its colonies expanded. New markets opened in Latin America and Asia. British factories kept running, credit flowed, gold arrived from overseas. While Europe strangled itself, Britain adapted. The blockade was becoming a self-inflicted wound. By 1810, Napoleon faced a terrifying reality. The Continental System was failing. Britain was still standing, Europe was suffering, and one empire in particular had become the weak link: Russia. Russia's economy depended on exports. Grain, timber, raw materials sold primarily to Britain. Cutting off that trade devastated Russian finances. Inflation rose, government revenue fell. The nobility suffered, merchants protested. The Russian elite began quietly reopening ports to British ships. Napoleon saw this as betrayal. For him, the blockade was not optional, it was the core of his strategy. If Russia broke the system, the entire structure would collapse. Britain would regain Europe, the war would never end. So Napoleon made his final calculation. If Russia would not obey the blockade, Russia would be forced to obey. Not with tariffs. With armies. In 1812, Napoleon assembled the largest military force the world had ever seen. Over 600,000 men, drawn from every corner of his empire. French, German, Polish, Italian, an army designed not just to defeat Russia but to save an economic strategy that was already failing. The invasion of Russia was not about territory. It was about money. It was about enforcing an economic system that Europe could not sustain. And it would cost Napoleon more than any battle he had ever fought. The most expensive mistake in history had already begun. The invasion of Russia began as an economic necessity disguised as a military campaign. Napoleon did not march east for glory. He marched because the Continental System was collapsing under its own contradictions. Russia's defiance threatened to expose the truth. Europe could not survive without British trade. If Russia openly resumed commerce with Britain, other states would follow. The blockade would dissolve. Britain would win the war without firing a shot. Napoleon believed force could correct economics. He believed armies could repair a broken system. In June 1812, the Grand Army crossed the Niemen River. More than 600,000 men moved eastward in endless columns. It was the largest force ever assembled in Europe, but it was not built for Russia. It was built for speed, intimidation, and decisive battle. It assumed supply lines would hold. It assumed cooperation from conquered lands. It assumed a short campaign. Those assumptions were fatal. Russia did not fight Napoleon's war. The Russian army retreated. It burned villages, fields, and granaries behind it. Every mile the French advanced, their logistics weakened. Supply depots emptied, horses died, wagons broke, roads dissolved into mud. The Grand Army was consuming more resources than Europe could provide. And this was not a battlefield failure. It was an economic one. Napoleon's empire depended on constant movement of goods: food, fodder, uniforms, ammunition, boots. The Continental System had already strangled trade. Now the invasion strangled supply itself. The deeper the army moved into Russia, the more it depended on a system that no longer functioned. By August, shortages became routine. Bread rations shrank, meat disappeared. Foraging became survival. Soldiers scattered into the countryside, stripping villages that had already been stripped. Discipline weakened, disease spread. Still, Napoleon pressed forward. Moscow was the objective, not because it mattered strategically, but because Napoleon believed symbols still had power. If Moscow fell, Russia would negotiate, the blockade would be restored, Britain would be isolated again. But economics does not surrender to symbolism. When the French reached Moscow, they found a city already defeated by absence. The population had fled, supplies were gone, warehouses were empty, and then the city burned. Fire consumed what little remained. Napoleon had conquered a ruin. There was no treaty, no submission, no economic relief. The Grand Army sat inside a hollow victory, surrounded by nothing it needed. Winter approached. Napoleon waited, hoping Russia would blink, hoping the mere occupation of Moscow would force compliance, but Russia understood something Napoleon refused to accept. Time favored the economy that could endure, and Napoleon's could not. When retreat became inevitable, the damage was already done. Supply lines that had barely held during the advance collapsed completely during withdrawal. Horses froze, men starved, artillery was abandoned. Wagons were burned for heat. Entire divisions dissolved into scattered survivors. The Russian winter did not destroy the Grand Army. The economic collapse did. Cold merely finished what logistics began. As the army retreated westward, the cost became unimaginable. Hundreds of thousands died, not in battle, from hunger, exposure, disease, exhaustion. By the time the remnants crossed back into Europe, fewer than 100,000 remained. Napoleon had lost the core of his military power. And with it, his ability to enforce the Continental System. Europe saw the truth immediately. If Napoleon could not enforce the blockade, it was meaningless. Ports reopened, smuggling turned into trade, Britain surged back into continental markets, credit flowed, goods returned, prices stabilized, not because of Napoleon but because of his failure. The economic weapon that was meant to destroy Britain had destroyed France instead. Napoleon attempted to recover. He raised new armies. He demanded more men, more taxes, more resources from exhausted states, but the foundation was gone. The empire had been built on conquest financed by control of Europe's economy. That control was broken. Britain seized the moment. It financed new coalitions. Gold flowed to Austria, Prussia, Russia, armies reformed, resistance hardened, the war shifted from containment to destruction. And Napoleon, who once controlled Europe's economic arteries, now faced a united continent funded by the very system he failed to destroy. The irony was complete. The Continental System had aimed to bankrupt Britain. Instead, it bankrupted Napoleon. France's economy was in ruins, trade disrupted, industry weakened, public debt soared, confidence eroded, allies defected, neutral states turned hostile. The empire that once dictated terms now reacted to events it could not control. Napoleon still won battles. But wars are not won on battlefields alone. They are won by systems. And Napoleon had broken his own. By 1814, the end was unavoidable. Coalition armies entered France, Paris fell, Napoleon abdicated, an empire that once spanned Europe collapsed in less than 2 years. Not because of a single defeat, but because of an economic strategy that misunderstood reality. Napoleon believed he could command markets the way he commanded armies. He believed decrees could override incentives. He believed discipline could replace trade. He believed force could sustain an artificial system indefinitely. History proved him wrong. Britain survived because its economy adapted. Napoleon fell because his could not. The Continental System stands as one of the most expensive mistakes ever made, not measured in currency alone but in lives, power, and permanence. It showed that economic warfare, when misapplied, becomes self-destruction. And it revealed a truth empires learned too late. You cannot blockade the world without blockading yourself. The collapse of Napoleon's empire did not arrive with a single battle. It arrived with exhaustion. After the catastrophe in Russia, Europe was no longer afraid of Napoleon. It was afraid of continuing to obey him. The illusion of invincibility had shattered, and with it, the fragile economic system that held his empire together. Conquest had expanded his power. Economics had sustained it, and now economics was turning against him. The Continental System still existed on paper, but it no longer functioned in reality. Ports reopened quietly. British goods returned openly. Merchants stopped pretending. Customs officials looked away. Governments that had once feared Napoleon now feared bankruptcy more. Trade resumed because survival demanded it. Napoleon understood this. He saw the erosion everywhere. Revenue fell, tax collection weakened, armies required funding that no longer existed, allies demanded concessions, neutral states drifted away, the empire once unified by dominance fractured under economic pressure. Yet Napoleon refused to abandon the system. Admitting failure would mean admitting that the foundation of his strategy was wrong. That Britain's power had not been economic fragility but resilience. That markets could not be coerced indefinitely. That an empire cannot survive by isolating itself from the world it seeks to control. So he doubled down. New decrees followed, tighter restrictions, more seizures, more penalties, but enforcement required soldiers and soldiers required money. Both were in short supply. Every attempt to revive the Continental System accelerated resistance. Every enforcement action cost more than it gained. The empire was bleeding from within. France itself began to suffer openly. Factories lacked raw materials, colonial goods vanished, prices surged, black markets expanded, ordinary citizens blamed the empire for scarcity, support eroded, the promise of stability that had once justified endless war dissolved into resentment. Meanwhile, Britain thrived. Its navy controlled global trade routes, its merchants expanded into Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Latin American markets opened as Spain weakened. British credit financed allies and insurgents alike. Gold flowed into London. Insurance markets flourished. The very pressure Napoleon intended to apply had forced Britain to globalize faster. The blockade had accelerated Britain's rise. And Europe paid the price. By 1813, the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Prussia rebelled, Austria defected, Russia advanced westward. The coalition no longer fought defensively, it fought to dismantle Napoleon's system entirely. Each advance liberated ports, each victory reopened trade, each defeat for France restored economic circulation. The empire unraveled in sequence. Armies still clashed, but the outcome was decided elsewhere. Supply lines failed, recruitment faltered, funding collapsed. Napoleon could still command troops, but he could no longer command resources. The Battle of Leipzig sealed the military collapse, but the economic collapse had already occurred. France could not replace losses, it could not finance sustained resistance, it could not isolate Britain again. The Continental System was dead. In 1814, coalition forces entered Paris. Napoleon abdicated. He was exiled to Elba. The empire dissolved almost instantly. Borders were redrawn, governments restored, trade resumed. The world Napoleon tried to reshape snapped back into a form that resembled the old order, but with one crucial difference. Britain emerged stronger than before. It dominated global trade, its financial system stood unrivaled. Its navy enforced a commercial order that spanned continents. While Napoleon attempted to starve Britain into submission, Britain learned to live without Europe. And when Europe reopened, Britain owned the channels. The irony was complete. Napoleon's greatest ambition was to break Britain's economic power. Instead, he confirmed it. The Continental System proved that attempting to suppress trade through force only shifts it elsewhere. Markets adapt, networks reroute, power flows around obstacles. Economic warfare, when misunderstood, becomes self-sabotage. Napoleon's failure reshaped European thinking permanently. States learned that controlling territory did not guarantee controlling trade, that armies could conquer cities but not supply chains, that economic systems had their own logic, one that punished coercion. The lesson echoed through history. Later empires would attempt similar strategies: blockades, sanctions, trade restrictions. Each time the outcome depended not on intent but on structure, on who controlled finance, on who adapted fastest, on who understood that power in the modern world was increasingly invisible. Napoleon had tried to wage war against an economy and lost. By the time he returned briefly in 1815, the system he built was gone. The 100 Days were a last echo of former power. Waterloo ended the illusion permanently. Exile followed. Reflection followed. The man who once dictated Europe's future faded into history. But his mistake did not. The Continental System remains one of the clearest examples of economic overreach in history. A strategy born from brilliance, executed with confidence, undone by misunderstanding. It shows how even the greatest military genius can fail when he mistakes force for leverage. Napoleon believed Europe could survive without Britain. He was wrong. Europe needed trade more than obedience. And Britain needed only time. The cost of this miscalculation was staggering: millions of lives disrupted, entire economies distorted, a generation sacrificed to enforce a system that could never work. The Russian invasion alone destroyed the core of Napoleon's power, not because of weather but because supply could not follow ambition. The true enemy was not winter. It was arithmetic. In the end, Napoleon did not lose because he lacked courage, intelligence, or vision. He lost because he attempted to bend the economic reality of an interconnected world to his will. And the world refused. The lesson endures. Economic warfare is not bloodless, it does not obey commands, it punishes excess, and when wielded without understanding, it destroys the one who deploys it. Napoleon tried to starve an island empire. Instead, he starved his own. And that mistake, measured in lives, power, and history, cost more than $100 billion in modern terms. It cost him everything: